So once again, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. Very excited to be talking about AI in the hiring process and talking about scaling without bias. So first things first, I'd like to go over a really quick agenda on what we're going to talk about this afternoon. I'm also going to talk about our speaker introduction. So in terms of an agenda for this afternoon, we're going to be talking a little bit about who you're joined by, talk about myself, talk about Dave Mayers. We're also going to go through a quick overview of AI in the process. So whether that's talking about opportunities for AI in the hiring process, talking about issues with AI, and then if time permits, we're going to go over the Naukri process and how we use AI here at Naukri, talk a little bit about candidate inputs, take a look at what recruiter outputs look like. And then lastly, obviously, we're going to leave time for some questions and answers. So I'm going to do a quick speaker introduction and then we're off to the show. So nice to meet everyone. My name is David Amy. I'm an enterprise account executive here at Naukri. I've been in the HR tech space for about 5.5, 6 years now. Really excited to be discussing the topic of artificial intelligence. It's something that I think is very, very important and it's certainly an up and coming topic in the HR space. Dave, I hope you're all right with me talking a little bit about you. So Dr. Dave, as we call him around here, is actually an industrial and organizational psychologist that specializes in the area of recruitment and selection. So Dave's been with us here at Naukri for over 2 years now as our chief scientist and head of IO psychology. Dave brings with him years of experience in the areas of selection testing and validation, and we're very lucky to have him join us today to talk a little bit about the work that he's doing in the area of AI and automated interviews. So please make sure to stick around after the presentation for a chance to ask Dave directly some of those AI questions you might have. Again, I mentioned in some of the media leading up to the webinar that this is a pretty hot topic for us, so we're opening up the floor for all sorts of questions you might have when it comes to artificial intelligence in the hiring process. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Dave.
All right. Thank you, David, for that warm introduction. So I'm just going to go through our little agenda here again and get started. So I thought it would be a really good idea to start today with a brief overview of AI so that we can all just be a little bit more familiar with things. So, I mean, there's a lot going on in AI, especially machine learning, and a really good understanding of this, kind of requires some knowledge of linear algebra, statistics, calculus, computer programming. But since we only have so much time, I wanted to just go through a few of the basics to make sure we're all on the same page. For those of you who are viewing that have a pretty good of AI and machine learning, this will just be a quick overview to give you a sense of how in depth we're going to go today. But for those of you who have little to no experience with AI, the goal is for you to come away from today's discussion thinking, I get it, and maybe understand things well enough to take some of what we discussed today and explain it to someone else. So let's get started. This image here really gives you a good high-level overview, somewhat of like a bird's eye view of artificial intelligence. On the outer layer, we have artificial intelligence, or AI. So what is AI? Well, that can mean a whole range of things depending on who you ask. When we discuss artificial intelligence in terms of its formal definition, it's pretty simple. All it refers to is really, the simulation of intelligent behavior done by computers. So, I mean, although this definition is accurate, it's not really that helpful. And this is because at the most basic level, a calculator is AI. So what most people are referring to when they say AI is some of the more complex topics that fall under the purview of AI. For example, AI can be used to recognize objects or images, used in self-driving cars, can also be used to navigate a map of a subway line, translate between languages, have a conversation with a computer, and much more. So many of the other tasks, in the broader field of AI fall into a particular subfield called machine learning. Okay, so let's go down to the next layer, machine learning. So if AI is dedicated to the simulation of intelligence, machine learning is actually focused on a particular aspect of intelligence, that of learning. In many ways, machine learning is similar to the way a child learns not to put their hand on a hot surface or how not to get their fingers jammed in a closing drawer. The goal of machine learning is to be introduced to an environment, look around, learn about that environment, pick up on patterns, and use an understanding of the patterns in the environment to guide and predict future events. So with your child, after experiencing enough of an environment to learn about patterns, the child who may have gotten their hands stuck in the drawer, maybe a dozen times is in a situation where now they have their fingers inside the drawer as it's closing, and right before it closes, they pull their hand out in anticipation. So what the child has done is apply machine learning, and if we look at it from that perspective, they've created an algorithm. And so, what is an algorithm? So an algorithm is simple. It's just basically a set of rules or instructions that a computer is going to follow when doing things like calculations or solving problems. And we can use an algorithm to accomplish a range of different tasks. So in the case of the learning child, the algorithm would be as follows. When it looks like the drawer is going to close, remove your fingers from harm's way. In machine learning, data is the environment that we learn about, and in most cases, it's up to the scientist or the practitioner to decide what data they want to use and how they want to learn about the data in their environment. So let's take a little bit more of a tangible example of machine learning. Right now, it's playoff season in the NBA, and we want to know which team is predicted to win the championship between the two final teams. Well, we can actually use machine learning to do that. What we can do is take all of the data from all of the championship finalists from the history of the NBA, and we can use that data to train a model that understands what aspects of a team or what events occur during the regular season make a team more likely to win the championship. In the case of basketball, we can have things like the number of games they won in the regular season, the number of injuries they endured, the draft pick order they received, the number of ticket sales, and the list goes on. We also have information about whether or not the team did in fact win the championship. So this piece of information is crucial for a specific type of machine learning called supervised learning, where we know some result about the team and we include that in our data, and that result is what we're actually getting at the model to understand. This little extra bit of information is what we call a label. And so we can take all this data and build a model that finds patterns in the data and helps us predict our label, which in this case is whether or not a team will win or lose a championship. The output of all of this model training and all of this learning is called a hypothesis function or algorithm. And with this algorithm, we can then plug in all the data from this year's two finalists and get, the probability that each one will win. And so what we're looking for in this case is which team has the highest probability of winning. And well, what you do with that information is beyond the scope of today's talk, but with great power comes great responsibility. We now have a pretty good idea of who's going to win the championship, at least from a machine learning and probability standpoint. Okay, so hopefully that example helps anyone who's just starting to pick up machine learning to give you just a really good idea of what's going on. So now what we're going to do is we're going to move on to that next layer. The next layer is deep learning. So deep learning is a specific subfield of machine learning that differs just so very slightly in how it learns about patterns in the environment. If we go back to our AI's intelligence understanding, some argue that deep learning is one step closer to true intelligence compared to a standard machine learning approach. And there are areas in deep learning like unsupervised reinforcement learning, fancy names like that are pretty much as close as we've gotten to mimicking true intelligence. With machine learning, it takes an expert or someone that is trained in a particular domain to actually determine how the data will be used to explain the outcome or the label. With deep learning, we actually create a little bit more space between the scientist and the algorithm. With deep learning, we allow the model to have full control to create its own understanding of patterns in the data and to combine data in whatever way it thinks is best in order to improve the model and its confidence in a particular conclusion. Scientists still have a great degree of control over the data that will be used to learn, but the complexity surrounding how that data is combined in the model is not really well understood by scientists that are building the algorithm. So there's that one step of distance between the scientist and the algorithm. However, I mean, many things in this world do require complex combinations of data. For example, things like image recognition, recognizing faces. There's a lot of different features that work together to kind of give the impression of a face. So these deep learning models have actually proven to be immensely powerful approaches for some applications and can achieve results that are not actually possible with some of the more simple machine learning approaches. So I think I'll stop there. And so just as a summary to wrap this all up, AI is a broad field dedicated to, the use of computers to replicate human intelligence. Machine learning is all about finding patterns in the data. And, deep learning is really about, figuring out how to combine data in ways that are not predetermined by a researcher, but through the use of sophisticated combinations of calculations that are carried out by the computer and layered on top of what we provided. So now I'm going to move on to what the opportunity is for AI in selection. So now that we know about AI, let's talk about how it can be used for hiring. First, we'll start with the goal of the hiring process. What is the goal of a hiring process? The goal of the hiring process is to take a pool of applicants and from that applicant pool decide which ones are good and which ones are not good, which ones will likely meet expectations, which ones are not likely to meet expectations. Then we make offers to those who are likely to meet expectations and gently decline those that are not. With AI, and more specifically with machine learning, we can actually build an algorithm that uses data we have on applicants to make qualified and not qualified distinctions. And the beauty of an algorithm is that we can use it repeatedly. So it can be used so many times, simultaneously that we actually completely remove the burden of human resources to go through a lot of information and take their time to go through the information. We can get a computer to do a lot of the things that humans would generally have to do and take a while to do. We can do them very quickly. And so in the world of hiring, there's actually a large opportunity for automation to make the hiring process more efficient and to remove a lot of the biases. So let's start with the first one, creating efficiencies. So there are some things that we need to do when we hire an employee. We may need to post a job, invite applicants, search through resumes, schedule and conduct interviews, et cetera, et cetera. For example, we might be looking at candidates for a particular set of skills located on a resume. Instead of sifting through a stack of resumes manually, we can use something like AI to create a list of skills that we're looking for and then return a stack of resumes where we have those skills identified. In this case, the use of AI is perfect, right? So no need for a human, we can just automatically sift through this stack of resumes. Going even further, we can actually use some more complex statistical models like regression or even machine learning to build an algorithm that actually weighs the various pieces of information that you can get from a resume based on how likely that information is to predict something like performance on the job. And so once again, the beauty of the algorithm is that it can be scaled to account for high volumes of applicants. So it can dramatically reduce the time required to go through all of these applicants. The next thing is removing bias. So with bias, one of the most beneficial aspects of AI is that we can actually remove the individual's decision-making process from manipulating the way that applicants are treated. So when it comes to hiring, it's very important that we consistently look at all of applicants in a way that is fair and judgments are based on information that is related to the job. And so AI can help with that. Humans are notorious for using heuristics, shortcuts, and this can result in bias creeping into that decision-making process. Even something that's considered rather benign, like the time of day or the weather outside, can influence the way a recruiter might perceive and act on information, especially if they don't have a rigid process that they're following. So with the use of AI, an algorithm can be developed to help provide insight and aid in decision making, and this algorithm can be applied consistently across all applicants. All right, so now I'm going to move on to some of the issues with previous attempts of using AI in hiring. So I assume that everyone here has probably heard about at least one headline that has tried to question the use of AI for various decisions made about applicants in the hiring process. I'm not going to go into any one of these headlines specifically, but instead what I've done is I try my best to summarize the bulk of these claims into the themes that they share. So the first theme is black box AI. For whatever reason, most of the machine learning solutions for hiring rely a great deal on deep learning. And although this type of machine learning can be very powerful, one of the major drawbacks to deep learning is that it's very difficult to understand exactly how the algorithm is using the data it was given to make decisions. The problem alone has actually spawned an entire area of research called explainable AI. And so at this time, the field of explainable AI is kind of still in its infancy. However, vendors in this space are still developing solutions and still selling them, even though they still have clear issues with explainability. And so while I do think that, as we spend more time on this, we will be able to achieve a better level of understanding, at the moment, the field of explainable AI is just not there yet. And many have difficulty still justifying the decisions that some of these systems are making, especially when they rely heavily on deep learning. Now, even though we have this explainability issue, some might argue that when it comes to algorithms, it doesn't really matter if we can't explain how we get the result or how the algorithm works if we get a good result. So who cares? But what we have actually seen in hiring is that that argument doesn't really hold up. Similar to the financial industry, where banks have an obligation to explain to clients, why they might have gotten declined for a mortgage, the same thing applies with hiring, where there's an increased interest in transparency and accountability when it comes to hiring. So we really want to know, what information was used to actually get to a decision about an applicant. And so users of these systems are actually putting a lot of pressure on vendors to provide better explanations for how these systems arrive at a particular conclusion. So that takes care of the black box AI thing. So really, black box AI is one of the issues that we've found, but what we've also found is that there are issues with training data. So there are numerous selection vendors and organizations that have developed algorithms using historical data that have resulted in algorithms making decisions that penalize certain groups of individuals for reasons that are unrelated to the job. If we now draw on our understanding of machine learning, so if we go back and we think, well, what is machine learning? We know that these models learn from data we provide them. So there's actually a few different ways data can be biased. And if we have biased data going in, we'll have biased outcomes coming out. So if the person designing the algorithm uses data that is misrepresentative of the population, so the group of people that we want to apply the algorithm to, the model may not generalize well. So it was built on one group of people, but we want to use it on another group of people. So we really have to kind of be careful that we don't fall into that trap. Another possibility is that the patterns in the data relate more to things like demographic groups or say social economic status than applicant quality. But the model will use this data to help build an understanding of the outcome, and so these biases are actually embedded within the algorithms. Now, if this happens, the result is that we have algorithms that are actually more consistent with an understanding of different groups and not necessarily related to applicant quality. We want the data that the model is going to use to get to an outcome to be as most related to the job as possible. And so the bottom line is, garbage in, garbage out. When you're not careful about the data that's being used to train an algorithm, you can actually find yourself in a really sticky situation. So let's take both of these issues together and take a look at scaling AI in things like recruitment and selection. So these issues should be avoided as much as possible. However, there are examples of solutions out there where these limitations persist, especially if we look at some of the other automated interview solutions. So most automated interview solutions that we've seen use deep learning and they use deep learning to replicate the overall judgment or a score that an interviewer would give an applicant response to a question. So not only are these systems incredibly black boxy because they use deep learning, but they also might be built using biased data. So to train these models, these interview algorithms, a common approach is to start with a bunch of interview responses that have already been rated by an interviewer. Then we use this data from these videos, whether it be audio, visual data, to actually train a model to use patterns in that data to predict back the overall ratings that were provided by the interviewer. So with a large data set, it's pretty good in terms of being able to replicate the judgment of the interviewer, and we can do so with a pretty good degree of accuracy. But what if those ratings that the model is trying to predict are actually biased in themselves? So think back to our basketball example, right? So we have all this information about a team, and we want to know if it predicts whether or not they're going to win or lose. So we have all the history of the NBA in our data file that we're using to, train an algorithm. But instead of having objective data about which teams won and lost a championship, we instead had someone watch the games and, without looking for the actual score, just kind of thought about it and kind of picked the team they thought played a better game. So if you trained a model to predict those judgments, all the bias in that rating process is actually baked right into the algorithm and acted upon when the algorithm's used. And so we need to be very careful that the outcomes we are training to predict are also free from bias. Not only the training data, in terms of the information that we're trying to find patterns in, but the outcomes as well also have to be as bias-free as possible. And what's interesting is, some suggest that interview ratings come from trained interviewers, they're using detailed rating scales. But what's interesting about this is that, there's an entire field of research on rater bias that shows that even with proper training, like frame of reference training, which is like the gold standard, rating bias still exists and it's still there. So there's really no way of escaping, right? So although we can, use rater training to reduce bias, little can be done to actually remove this bias from the inferences that are made when scoring an interview response. All right, so now that we're pretty comfortable with how we use AI, machine learning, and we're, getting some, a little bit more comfortable with some of the limitations, let's move on to building an automated interview engine. So this is something that Naukri has put a lot of work in, trying to build an automated interview that removes as much bias as possible so that we can help organizations scale the use of AI in recruitment without carrying with it that bias. And so the algorithms that we've designed help us predict whether or not a candidate will perform well on the job based on information gathered from the responses to interview questions. This means that each applicant is given the same set of questions or a similar set of questions that measure the same thing and are scored in a consistent manner. So Naukri has an automated interview that's asynchronous. That means questions to the interview are pre-recorded and applicants record their responses to these questions at a time that's most convenient for them. Choosing interviews as the assessment type was intentional. There are several different assessment types: cognitive ability, personality testing, game-based assessments, situational judgment tests. But structured interviews are interesting in that they're actually the best predictor of performance on the job. And structured interviews also are better for things like diversity, right? So what we have is a good signal to predict performance, and we have better diversity than we get with something like a cognitive ability test. So with structured interviews, we start with an incredibly strong signal for predicting performance, and we can get there without capsizing the diversity of our applicant pools. Now, unfortunately, structured interviews are very time intensive and costly, so they're usually not used to, narrow down a list of applicants. They're kind of used once we've already narrowed down a list of applicants. But by automating structured interviews, you can actually put all your applicants through a structured interview and not just the few finalists. This means that organizations can better identify candidates that are likely to meet expectations and they can identify these candidates right at the top of the funnel. So let's move on to the next part of the process. So to score an interview response, Naukri only uses audio. So although candidates complete the assessment while recording themselves on video, none of the video is actually used, and we do not use any of the audio data other than the transcript. So the video is only there to really improve applicant experience. So to score, we're only interested in what they say, not what they sound like, not how they're dressed, not what their background looks like. And to do this, we put their audio file through a transcription process. So let's stop there. Transcription. Oh, are there problems with that? So it's very possible that there can be issues when we're transcribing an applicant's audio file. It's not a major theme, but something we definitely need to pay attention to when working with audio transcription. We want to make sure that the data we receive is of good quality. For example, there might be certain groups of applicants that have different access to technology. Does the tech you have influence your ability to perform on our assessments? Is there a difference between completing a video with a phone or a handheld device compared to a desktop or a laptop? Are differences in the environment going to influence the quality of the response? I mean, it's also possible that accents can have an impact on how well an applicant's response can be transcribed. So Naukri uses a few different approaches to ensure really good quality audio files and transcription. So these are the things that we have to think about and consider when trying to prevent bias from scaling with a solution. So let's move on to the next part of the process. So once we have the transcript, the next thing we do is analyze the content of the response. It is at this step in the process where we find Naukri's secret sauce. So this is where our approach to automated interviews really starts to diverge from some of the other solutions that are being sold by other vendors or being presented by academics in the field. So recall that other automated solutions try to replicate that overall interview response that would have been given by an interview. We know that those inferences contain bias. Therefore, to remove bias, you need a better solution. So instead of replicating the overall ratings, Naukri's algorithm is designed to replicate the actual process that an interviewer would use to score an interview response. So to score an interview, an interviewer would typically listen to the previous work experiences discussed by an applicant and identify important work behaviors discussed by the speaker. Then the interviewer would determine the overlap between what behavior the applicant spoke about and the measurement rubric they're using to score the applicant, right? So easy process. And so the Naukri system is designed to do exactly that. The Naukri automated interview is designed to identify from the universe of work behavior what work behavior an applicant spoke about in their response to a behavioral interview question and where in the response they spoke about that behavior. It then provides credit for the behavior according to its importance to both the skill being measured and the job being hired for. So that's a little glimpse into what our algorithms are built to do. So when a new algorithm is built, so we do this periodically, we go through additional testing before models are actually used in production. So not only do we need to ensure that models work, we also need to ensure that the models work equally well for different groups of applicants. Some of what we do is test the model's ability to identify behavior depending on different demographic groups, as well as demographic intersections. For example, does the algorithm predict behavior equally well for white females compared to Hispanic females, or males with a disability compared to females with a disability? And we also look at outcome data. So the decisions that an algorithm makes about an applicant, are those equal, or are we resulting in unfair treatment across demographic groups or these demographic group intersections? All right, so that's what we do in this text analysis phase. So now moving on to the final step here, we score an applicant. And so in the final step, once we calculate a raw score for an applicant based on the behavioral nature of their response, we then compare that raw score against a benchmark to determine how well this applicant fared compared to others who have responded to the same question. These benchmarks can be established in a few different ways depending on the benchmark reference group. So which group are we going to compare this applicant to? So what you end up with is a percentile ranking for each response that tells us how many applicants scored equal to or below this applicant's response. We then determine the applicant's percentile for the entire interview in a similar way and arrive at the overall percentile ranking. So in sum, the Naukri system does not attempt to replicate the overall judgment that someone would make about a candidate response. Instead, it replicates the actual process that an interviewer would go through to arrive at an overall judgment. It then provides very clear output that can be used to determine exactly why an applicant received the score they did on the interview. And so I think this is where I'll leave things for now and pass things back to David, who's going to let us see what all of this looks like in action.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dave. Really appreciate that. Really good overview into sort of what I'm going to talk about and show on my portion of the webinar. And I just want to let everyone know, absolutely, if you have questions popping up now, please feel free to drop them in. We actually already have a few coming in. So I'll make sure to ask Dr. Dave about those at the end of the presentation. As I prep my screen here, I'm going to just make sure that we can see the actual front end of the platform. So if I can click here, I'm going to turn off my webcam. Okay, great. So hopefully you can see my screen. What I've shared is the very first step in the process for candidates who are going through a Naukri assessment. So what you're seeing is the landing page that candidates get to once they receive an email from their whichever organization they're applying with to start an assessment. The email itself is very simple. We do describe why we're doing the assessment, a little bit about the assessment, and we have quite a bit of customization as well. It's important to note that the emails actually come from the hiring organizations and not Naukri, just so candidates are kept on the same track and they get to see the same process the whole way through. So really important details to note here. This entire process is customized based on our client's needs. So depending on which logos and coloring they like to use, that's going to be added for the process, because again, we do want to make this as intuitive as possible for candidates, and we do want to keep it simple and keep it as a process that's familiar to them. So we've got the important details. We have the candidate's name, welcoming them to the assessment. We have the job role, that's usually the job title. And then we have the location for the role. And then we have some details about the assessment itself. So we have things like the assessment deadline, the average time it's going to take to complete this assessment in particular. I only 8 minutes for this one because I only have 2 questions. I have 1 video question and I have 1 audio question. Candidates are then going to read and agree to the terms and conditions, which are all completely customizable based on the jurisdiction in which the candidate is. And then they're going to watch an intro video. So I'm going to play a couple seconds of this intro video, but this is something that our clients have picked out, whether they record it specifically for this assessment and this job requisition, or it's just a general recruitment marketing video that clients have picked. Right, we're not going to watch the whole video, although I do like it. Candidates are going to go to the next step and continue to their tech check setup. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So first, it's going to check for system permissions. If you didn't have it set up already, we would ask for those permissions to be set up. Continue. This process that you're watching right now, I am doing it on a PC and on a desktop, but it is accessible on Apple devices as well as Windows devices and all mobile devices as well. So that's really, really important to understand. If there are any permissions issues, we'll walk them through the process in this tech checkup, no matter what device they're using. So I'm going to flip over to my camera as well, make sure that's visible. Great, looks good. From here, we're going to continue. It's going to check my microphone levels. I'm actually going to change up my microphone, use my headset instead. Great, sounds good. So from here, they're going to click continue. The first question in this assessment is a video-based question. So right off the bat, when we have a question in the assessment, we give candidates the option to go through a practice tour. So this is very straightforward. It's exactly as it sounds. We give some interview tips. We have a portion here for notes for candidates to write some notes out as they're listening to the questions. And it also just walks them through the general layout of the page so they can be familiar with the process. At the end of the practice tour, we also ask a practice question. So this is important. This isn't an actual behavioral-based question. It's nothing something too intense, it's typically something fun, like, if you could be any animal in the world, which animal would you be and why? So I've done this enough times. I'm going to skip over the practice tour and go right to the assessment itself. Okay, so we're ready to start our first video question. All right, so once the question's been asked, candidates are given a time limit to think of their answers. We have, as I mentioned before, the notes over here where we can type whatever we like. This isn't visible to the hiring teams. This is just for candidates to be able to collect their thoughts. We also have the question directly as it was asked here in text format, so candidates can go over that again. This time limit is customizable, though there is a good reason that we have it at 60 seconds, and that there is a good reason that we keep 3 minutes to answer. We can talk a little bit more about that maybe at the end of the presentation, but for now, we'll skip over it quickly. So once the candidate's ready, they're going to click I'm ready. I'm going to actually play a pre-recorded answer here for you, so we'll watch a few seconds of that before we move on to the next assessment question. Okay, as I mentioned, we're not going to watch the whole thing. So once they're done answering, they're going to say yes, submit. So you'll notice that there's two options here. They can either upload their response if they're happy with it. If they're not, they can do a retry question. So this is a bit of an interesting topic. The retry questions themselves are not the exact same questions typically in a process. Now that can be changed, but we want to try to discourage candidates from trying to game the system. We can still gauge specific skills through behaviors that candidates speak about, but we just do it in a different way. We'll ask a different question so candidates can't just go through and keep retrying and retrying the questions. You can also limit the amount of retries candidates are able to do, but generally candidates will retry. If they feel like they messed up on a question and they want to do it again, they'll be presented with a different question gauging the same skills. So I'm happy with the response. I didn't have to record it, so easy enough for me. I'm going to say upload the response. Great. So now we're going to head towards the audio assessment. So just like video assessments, audio questions, they come in the form of a video, but candidates don't need to answer with a video. So the entire process is exactly the same, except for the candidate answering portion. So I'm going to skip ahead to the assessment. From here, we'll play the question. We'll skip over it because we've seen them already. I'm given the same 60-second timeline. When I'm ready and I start talking, what's going to happen is instead of having a video of myself, we're just going to have these blue lines going up and down so candidates maybe are a little bit more comfortable with just talking about their learned behaviors and their skills instead of having a video taken from what they're doing. Once candidates are done, they're going to say done answering, and they're going to go through the same process. They're going to say yes, submit, and they're going to upload their response. Awesome. The last step in the process is very, very important. We're going to continue to submit the questions, and the candidates can watch an outro video about the organization that they just did the assessment for. Again, I'm not going to make anyone go through this entire video process. We're going to submit the responses, this big flashing button here, and then we're good to go. Now, something really, really important to keep in mind before I jump off of the candidate experience is that we do ask candidates for how they found the process. So it's exceptionally important for us to keep a finger on the pulse when it comes to this candidate experience. We are trying to collect an NPS score for our organizations and our clients to make sure that, candidates are liking the process, that they do want to go through it again, and that they have a good experience with it. We also keep track of all the comments that people leave for us. I'm pretty biased, so I'm going to say I loved it. Submit the feedback. Once that's done, the candidate process is over, and we can take a quick look in the back end here to see what these outputs look like. Okay, so I'm going to flip over now and share what that output looks like on the back end. Excellent, and hopefully you can see my screen. Dr. Dave, can I get a thumbs up to make sure that my recruiter profile is showing properly? Awesome. So I just want to be cognizant of time here, running up on about 45 minutes. So I'm going to be really brief about what the back end of the recruiter's dashboard looks like here on the Naukri platform. So what you're taking a look at here is a finished report. So this is after the candidate's gone through the process, the AI has done their portion, it's been scored, and this candidate in particular has been percentile scored against a group of candidates as well. So we can see here a breakdown of the skills that we're assessing, right? So these are the skills that we're taking a look at based on the behaviors that the AI was listening for. And then we also have a breakdown specifically for each skill, how this candidate performed in their cohort. You'll notice that instead of a name, it has a set of numbers here, a candidate ID, and there's nothing here beyond an @Gmail. So this is the platform with the bias filter on. If organizations are more apt to see, a little bit more in-depth information about candidates, excuse me, they can turn the bias setting off, and you'll notice that this candidate was actually me. And you can actually also watch the videos as well once they've been scored to see how the candidate did. I would love to go through sort of the reporting that we do in the back end, as well as some of the personalizations. And I know Dave would love to talk a little bit about how we build these assessments. It is a self-serve platform that has a lot of really deep customizations. We just wouldn't have the time to go through it on a webinar. But I would encourage anybody who's interested in learning a little bit more about how to create these assessments, how the platform runs in depth, maybe what some of the personalizations and the email assessments and the scoring looks like. Super happy to set up a time to do that. Just please reach out after the webinar and we can talk a little bit about that. Great. So it's now time for our question and answers. We actually have a lot of really good questions already coming in. So I'm going to go ahead and switch back over here, change presenter to Dave, and we're going to go through some of these. So Q&A, we've got about 5 or 6 questions to go over now. So I'm going to start with those, Dave. I'll ask you directly. If anybody has any other questions as well as we're going along or you'd like to add on, please just drop it in the questions box and I'll make sure to bring it up with Dave. So one of the first questions we got, Dave, was from Anil. So Anil says, am I right in assessing AI is being used more for candidate selection? Wouldn't it be more helpful to have an equal focus on A, the job, skills and competencies, as well as B, the candidates? And I think this leads really well into sort of what we were discussing earlier about, training that AI model and what to look for, but I'll let you take the question.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe we do have a few seconds to kind of walk through just a little bit of the recruiter dashboard, but I think this really speaks to some of the stuff that we've put into building assessments that also starts touching on artificial intelligence, statistical approaches, and machine learning. And so I definitely agree. Using something like AI to take a look at jobs, understand job requirements, and then from that, pick and choose different skills that might be, most predictive of performance on the job. That's definitely something that we have baked right into the system. And so, really the heavy, kind of the heavy lifting of our AI solution is more on the candidate side. But it's definitely something that we have in the system. And so what we do is we take a look at which job an organization is trying to hire for. And from there, our system is designed to kind of go into that occupation, conduct a functional job analysis where we understand the critical work tasks and requirements of the job. And then from there, our system automatically spits out a list of behaviors and a list of skills that are most likely going to predict performance on the job. And so all of that is done in-house by the system itself. So it doesn't require any sort of human touch to that and can be used pretty much out of the box. So I don't know if we have time to do that, but it's definitely something that our system has the capability of doing. And I agree with you. I think that's a great way to go.
For sure. And you know what, if we do have time at the end, I can pop over and show it quickly. I'll just get through some more of these questions. So you've got some follow-ups as well. So another follow-up to that question, Dave, is can people game the system, right? So maybe using keywords or repeating themselves. I know you touched on it very briefly when you were talking about how we built our engine in particular, but we'd love to get your take on that.
Yeah, so I mean, gaming is something that we're always interested in. Can you game the Naukri system? Well, to date, I don't think we've seen anyone that has successfully gamed our system, so that's a good sign. So maybe that's a strike, on the good side of not being able to game it. But I mean, what we're doing is essentially replicating the process that a recruiter or an interviewer would go through in kind of, grading an interview. And so, when doing that, training for interviews is pretty much going to be the same. So there's a lot of coaching that goes into in-person interviews that we would apply to even our automated interview system. And so any sort of training that focuses on how you respond to different structured interview questions. So following the STAR method, where you kind of talk about a situation you were in, what kind of tasks you did, the actions you took, and kind of, what the result was. That's pretty much, the training that we would get for performing well on an in-person interview. And so that training is definitely going to help you improve your performance on a NOCRI assessment, but not to the extent that you'll be able to game it, just basically being more prepared. So coaching these applicants, and we're upfront with that. We tell candidates exactly what we're looking for, exactly how we want them to respond. And so that information is already there and it's already out in the open. And so really what we're doing is looking for people to talk about their experiences and put that together in a nice way so that our model can really identify the behavior that they're talking about and connect that to the behaviors that we're looking for the job that we're hiring for.
Yeah, really great. And I'll layer onto that as well, just from a product and client side as well. A big part of our role at Knockry is to prep clients to prep their candidates. And that can be done in a manner of ways, right? So everything from like the email customization, SMS alerts and respondents. But I think really just having that glass door look at what we're doing, right? We're not hiding anything. This is what we're looking for. We're looking for skills and behaviors. Talk about the experiences you've had and treat this as if we're a real interview. And it goes a really long way in terms of, looking at candidate experience and allowing people to progress through this in a manner that's easy for recruiters to be able to score. Recruiters are able to sort of collate the scored data in the back end as well. So that really, really helps. Dave, there's a question here from Ron. So Ron asks a question about how you determine the benchmark scores. So specifically in the last slide, I know we flashed up a bit of the percentile, and I showed it really briefly in my portion as well, but is it based on the average score of the team that the candidate is being hired for, or the organization on a whole? And maybe if you could talk a little bit towards benchmarking, because I know this is it's a big question. It's a lot to go through.
Yeah, that's Ron, that's a great question. And so, when it comes to benchmarking, what we try to do is get as close as we can to the job that's being hired for. And so what we do is we start with a representative sample of applicants that have applied to that particular job. If we have to look external to some of the data that we've collected with other clients first to start helping to build that benchmark, we do so. But in many cases, the organization has enough data to work with as we start rolling out our automated solution, where we're able to create benchmarks at the job level for people that have applied to work at that organization for that particular job. So in the best case scenario, we have job level benchmarks, and those job level benchmarks can differ depending on complexity, experience. And so there's a few different ways that we can kind of slice this. And so you're asking, as the organization as the whole, I mean, we could do that, but what we find is that building benchmarks based at the job level gives us the best result and gives the most amount of applicants a fair shot on our assessment. So hopefully that answers your question. Happy to follow that up too.
Yeah, really good too, Dave. And I think it helps highlight a lot of that. It's not solutions like this are rarely plug and play, right? We don't really have a solution where it's like, hey, sign up, get a login, and start to go. There's a lot of hands-on work required when building out the benchmarks and the assessments as well. And Dr. Dave is a big part of that for us here at Knockry, for any clients that come through the process, because we want to make sure that if we are checking for the competencies and we're looking for that matchup, that we're doing a good enough job and that clients are happy as well. You know what? There's a question here about the candidates and whether or not they like the process. I'll probably take that one if that's all right, Dave. So someone's asking, Sean's asking, do candidates like this process? So long and short is yes, actually. So we're very fortunate that we've done, I think, somewhere in the range of 200,000+ assessments across the globe, from everything from truck drivers to senior executives. And that five-star sort of rating system that I showed you at the end there, we average 4.7 out of 5 stars. So candidates do like the process. I think once they understand what the process is and how it works and why we're doing this process from both the diversity and inclusion lens, but also the efficiency lens, it's received quite well. So we're very proud about that score. We protect it a lot, and we make sure we always have our finger on the pulse in terms of our candidates going through it. Do they like it? Making sure we're mitigating things like drop off and collecting as much data as we possibly can. So hopefully that answers that question as well. Dave, so Anil has a follow-up question for you. So have you or your clients done different types of A/B testing on the efficacy of the solution? So for example, how does it compare with psychometric tests or traditional interviews? Just efficacy of the tool for assessing functional technical skills versus soft skills and behavior. So I think it's a two-parter. So if you want to cover off the how this model matches up against things like psychometric testing and other modalities for assessments, and then if you want to talk a little bit about the technical functional portion versus soft skills / behaviors would be great.
Yeah, so I think, what I'll do, Anil, is I'll take care of that second part of your question, which is, technical skills versus soft skills. I think I'd be amiss if I didn't just come out and say, like, the NOCRI system right now doesn't focus on measuring technical skills. So we're not, pumping out a bunch of coding assessments. We're not looking at kind of like those hard skills. One of the reasons for not doing that is because we kind of have the belief that a lot of the technical skills that are required for performance on the job are things that can either be easily learned on the job, or most applicants coming in either have those or don't have them, and there are other ways of assessing them other than an interview. And so we focus on soft skills and really focus on that behavioral piece. So just to be clear, like we're measuring more like those soft skills and those what we'd call foundational skills for performance. And these also tend to be a little bit more transferable across different occupations, so it gives us a little bit more flexibility in that regard as well. But when we talk about, let's go head to head with other psychometric tests. I mean, this is something that, our science team has a lot of fun with. We design and carry out validation studies in many different ways for our clients to try and help them establish, what we'd call the validity or the predictiveness of our assessments. And we also go head to head with other psychometric assessments that they're currently using to try and see, which one's working better? Are there different aspects of each one that are, doing a good job here, maybe not a good job there? So we definitely, we embrace the ability to be able to do some of these A/B tests with our clients, and we do so in a pretty, rigorous way where we're following, best practices in terms of psychometric testing and development. So great question. Happy to talk about that more. That's I love talking about validation and that sort of stuff. So
it's a deep one, yeah. If you hadn't noticed from listening to Dr. Dave, he absolutely has too much fun with this. Loves doing it, and so you could talk your ear off about it all day. But it's something that's near and dear to our heart for sure. I got a question here from Nasser. So will candidates who have a bad video quality suffer from not having state-of-the-art equipment? Like, is there a drop-off there for candidates that don't have good equipment and are gonna, is that gonna be a stopping block for folks like that? And I think you did cover it a little bit, Dave, when you talked about how the system works, but just a quick overview of that again will be great.
So just to be clear, our system doesn't use any of the video data. We're not looking at facial features or anything like that. So really all we're interested in is the audio file. And in terms of audio quality, there are situations where someone's audio might not be working to the degree that we expect it to in order to transcribe their response to a particular question. So what we do is we have a pretty rigorous tech check when people start the assessments. We want to make sure that their tech is working. We want to make sure that we're able to pick up what they're saying into their mic. But what we also have is a pretty rigorous Q&A process that does involve a little bit of human in the loop. So if we do get, applicants where tech does seem to be an issue, where, transcription might have failed for whatever reason, applicants are contacted as soon as possible and they're asked to redo the assessment, asked to, maybe retake one or two questions that might have failed. And that process is pretty seamless, and so far applicants have really appreciated, being notified that something wasn't working. They'll pick up a different mic, or they'll try their best to use another device. Or what we'll do is we'll work with that applicant and the organization to find an accommodation that works for that particular candidate. So I guess
that's really good.
Back to you, Dave. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I was going to layer on to that as well too, Dave. I mean, accessibility is truly something that we don't kid around about. Like, it's very, very important for us to make sure that every portion of what we do is accessible for candidates and recruiters. And I think especially when we look at the world of remote work, right? A lot of folks are working from home, their kids are at home, maybe they have pets there. And we do have the odd time when someone's recording an interview and somebody comes running into the room or something happens. And we do have to, if they don't have a chance to retry that. So I think the important takeaway is that there are human eyes at the end of the day that will look at that based on on, the confidence scoring of how we feel that the audio came through. As Dave mentioned, it's pretty rigorous for a Q&A portion, and we do have that, right? It's just the way things go, especially being an asynchronous platform. Folks are doing this on Sunday afternoons. They're doing this Saturday morning, right? They're doing it when they have time, as opposed to when a recruitment team is available to jump on and really talk about it. So I think we have time for probably one more question, which works out. So we've got a question here from Sukdeep. So I actually had the pleasure of meeting Sukdeep last week. So Sukdeep, thanks for coming to the webinar. Glad to see you here. Sukdeep asks, are there particular roles, for example, hiring for an executive role versus trying to mass hire for call centers, where software like ours is geared towards, like more geared towards? This is probably a team effort, Dave. So I'll take sort of the first crack at it and explain a little bit about it. So from a perspective of how the platform is currently being used, we have use cases across everything from those mass call centers up to those senior executives. Yes, it's fantastic to be able to draw from a larger pool of benchmarking and candidates, but at the end of the day, the framework at the back end is making those decisions and choosing to draw from that. We find that, and this is more from a candidate perspective, that it's actually quite well received in the senior executive suite. It is something that feels a little bit more personal for them. The questions, because they're recorded by the teams that are doing the hiring, it's a lot more personal. It's a lot more one-to-one. So it's being used across all facets in terms of like mass hiring volume, even down to things like talent management. So we have use cases for all of them. We just tweak the system here and there to sort of make that work. But Dave, do you have any layering on to do about that? Anything that you want to cover off?
Yeah, the only thing I think I would add here is, when we're looking at, the use of psychometric assessments, interviews, automated interviews, I think there's a really good opportunity here for, that really mass hire, right? So, when we're looking at scale, the more applicants that we have that we want to give, the opportunity to have a voice, to, provide a response, to answer, interview questions, the more beneficial this is going to be. Now, with that being said, I think when it gets to, some of these particular executive roles, a lot of these candidates that are applying to executive roles already get a lot of, one-on-one time with hiring committees. There's a lot of digging. We know a lot about these applicants when it gets to the executive role. So when it gets to the executive role, the use of our system is probably more used as, a complement to all the stuff that we want to do to identify, whether or not an executive applicant is going to likely meet expectations on the job. With mass hiring, this is a great tool that can be used early on in the funnel to help organizations kind of start to narrow down the field to some of the candidates that they really want to focus on. And so, use cases in both of these areas here. But when it comes to the use of large-scale selection testing, this is where I think you're going to have the biggest impact.
For sure. Great answer. Love it. So we're at time. Again, thank you everyone so much for joining us. I really appreciate that. Dave, thank you so much for taking the time out to talk to us a little bit about AI and answer the questions. As I mentioned before, please feel free to reach out to me directly. My email is david.amy@knockre.com. Happy to answer any further questions or book time to go through the demo. And we'll be sure to let you know when we host another webinar. So thank you again so much. Hope to see everyone soon. Bye-bye.